The Pentagon is bolstering its presence in the Middle East after pro-Iranian protesters tried to storm the embassy compound in Baghdad. Images of the aftermath show extensive damage in a burned-out reception area on the edge of the embassy compound. The unrest has sparked a response to U.S. airstrikes. CBS News' Natalie Brand reports from the Pentagon.
Defense Secretary Mark Esper says there are indications Shiite militias in Iraq are planning additional attacks. Esper briefed reporters off camera Thursday morning.
Do I think they may do something? Yes, and they will likely regret it.
The Pentagon has deployed 750 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne to the Middle East. An additional 3,000 are on alert and preparing to deploy.
It's not a show of force. It's a reinforcing capability that we can employ not just in Iraq, but throughout the region.
The move follows 2 days of violent protests where Iranian-backed demonstrators stormed the U.S. Embassy compound in Iraq. The protesters have dismantled their camp and moved on, but they left behind damaged buildings and possibly damaged relations between the U.S. and Iraq.
There's going to be a debate in the Iraqi parliament about whether the U.S. military should go home or not. That was the deal to get the protesters to withdraw.
The U.S. is still fighting ISIS in Iraq, and some are concerned a complete withdrawal from the country could hurt the war on terrorism.
It would be akin to the U.S. pulling out in 2011, which gave al-Qaeda in Iraq, which ultimately became ISIS, a big boost. So we could see that whole thing play out again.
Tensions in Iraq rose after the U.S. blamed Iranian-backed Shia militias for killing an American contractor in a missile strike on an Iraqi base last month. President Trump tweeted Iran will be held responsible for the attack on the embassy, but Iran's supreme leader taunted back, tweeting, "You can't do anything." Natalie Brand, CBS News, Arlington, Virginia.
Joining me now, Renad Mansour. He's a Middle East analyst with the foreign policy think tank Chatham House and research fellow for the Cambridge Security Initiative at the University of Cambridge. So, Renad, I want to start with who was behind the attack on the embassy. Here's what Major Garrett was able to get from pressing Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Tuesday.
Are they militants, terrorists, or what?
There's a mix of each, but make no mistake about it. This was directed by the Iranian leadership, and many of these people are designated terrorists.
Designated terrorists. How would you say, Renad, the Iranian government was able to get inside of Baghdad's green zone, attack the U.S.'s most fortified embassy in the world? How did that happen?
Well, it's been clear for several years now that the Iranian government has strong relations with the Iraqi security service, the Iraqi security forces. That includes both state and non-state groups. That includes both groups within the Ministry of Interior as well as militias and non-state armed actors. Iran works with all sides. And what you've seen in Iraq is kind of a blurring of that line. So many of these militias that rose up to fight ISIS haven't been integrated as such into the state. They still exist, but they have strong relations with other state forces. And that allows Iran to play both sides. That allows these groups to have 1 foot into the state, 1 foot into the government, and 1 foot out of the government. It is not easy to get into the green zone. And in fact, protesters in Iraq have tried for the last few months to get in. The fact that these groups that were able to get in means that they have some sort of relationship with those state forces that would allow them to come in. Either they were willing to or out of fear could not refuse them.
You talk about Iran wanting to play all sides. You've written about something called hybrid state actors. Can you explain sort of what that is and who participated?
Well, the idea is the way that we've sort of understood the Middle East is, or other parts of the world for that matter, are you have actors, state actors, i.e. the traditional militaries, then you have what are known as militias or non-state actors, which are outside of the state. But what you're seeing in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, elsewhere, but for this purpose, Iraq, are these actors that could one day be in the state, but also not completely in the state and outside of the state, especially in the context of Iraq, where the government remains quite weak. You have many different armed groups. You have hundreds of groups, hundreds of battalions. Some of them still will send their fighters into the Ministry of Interior and Defense, and some of them will keep them out. So that line between state and non-state is no longer that much of an important line. They're hybrid. They're hybrid in the sense that they're able to kind of play both sides, as I say, have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And this is a better way to try and understand how a group like Hezbollah could do what it did and move into places like the Green Zone.
What do you think this means, this attack, for U.S.-Iraqi relations?
Well, I think I think this attack is indicative of a strained relationship between the U.S. and Iraq, especially, of course, since 2003. If you remember, there was a time when the American president would, on a weekly basis, speak to the prime minister. This time around, the U.S. president has refused to invite the Iraqi prime minister to Washington, hasn't met the Iraqi prime minister. The U.S. president hasn't invited the Iraqi president to Washington. They had one meeting out off the back of a United Nations General Assembly event in New York earlier this year, in September of last year, sorry. So it's been clear for some time now that that leverage that the U.S. used to have, that influence that the U.S. used to have over Iraq's state officials is no longer there. And that's why, if you look at the response to this attack, condemnation didn't just come from the pro-Iranian groups in Iraq. Condemnation came from across the Iraqi political spectrum. Even those groups that are against Iran are also against the U.S. and its influence. So I think it's safe to say that the U.S. have very few friends left in the Iraqi state.
You know, Paula Reed, our White House correspondent, says when she travels with the president, one of the lines that gets incredible applause and reaction from folks attending President Trump's rallies is when he talks about pulling out of the Middle East and taking troops out of Iraq. If you were advising President Trump, what would you say to him about how to deal with the Middle East and Iraq at this point?
I think, I don't know how easy that job is to be the advisor of President Trump, but nonetheless, very clearly, the U.S. has to walk a delicate line, because there are times where the U.S. interests are on par or on the same side as Iraqi interests. The U.S. wants a strong Iraq. The U.S. calls for a strong Iraq that's free from any external interference, but what they talk about is free from Iranian interference. My advice would be that any time the U.S. had tried to directly intervene in Iraq, it hasn't really worked out so well. So there are channels to rebuild the state. There are allies to work with, but to politicize Iraq, to make Iraq the playground for a U.S.-Iran battle will destroy Iraq. And I think the U.S. need to have a sort of, if I was advising Trump, I would have a revision. I would reflect back on what has worked and what hasn't worked in the past, and try and rebuild the Iraqi state outside of the politics so that it could kind of come back. I think there's an opportunity now, because many Iraqis in the South are protesting against Iran, but that doesn't mean that they're automatically on Team America. In fact, they're also against America. But there are, when the interests come together, that's one way for President Trump to move in.
Renad Mansour. Renad, thank you so much for your insights.